The fog was thick that morning, clinging to the rooftops of London like a dark shroud, muting the sounds of the bustling city. The air was damp and the cold seeped through the cracks in the windows of 221B Baker Street. Dr. John Watson sat by the fireplace, his fingers wrapped around a cup of tea as the flames crackled and popped in the hearth. Sherlock Holmes, however, was anything but idle. The detective was pacing back and forth across the room, his mind clearly miles away from the dampened scene outside. Holmes was in one of his rare reflective moods, which Watson had come to recognize only when a new case was about to emerge. The ebb and flow of Holmes's thought process could be as unpredictable as a thunderstorm, and just as suddenly as the storm would break, so would the flood of ideas. It was a quiet morning. At least it seemed so, until the sound of a knock echoed from the door, disturbing the otherwise still silence. "Come in," Holmes called without looking up, his gaze fixed on a stack of newspapers spread across the desk in front of him. The door creaked open slowly, and in stepped a man who appeared to be in his late 40s. He was tall, with a broad frame that suggested an athletic build, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the burden of sleepless nights. His clothing, though well-tailored, was not of the finest quality. A gray woolen overcoat hung loosely on his shoulders, and his hands, which he clasped in front of him, trembled slightly. Dr. Watson, who had been observing Holmes with mild curiosity, now noticed the man's unease. There was something about him, a desperation in the air he carried, that immediately piqued Watson's interest. "Mr. Hale, I presume?" Holmes asked, not yet looking up from his papers. His voice was smooth, though laced with a touch of curiosity that was almost imperceptible. The man nodded stiffly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes, Jonathan Hale of New York." Holmes's head lifted at the mention of New York, his eyes narrowing slightly. He straightened up, his interest piqued. "Please take a seat, Mr. Hale." The man did so, his movements stiff and measured, as if each step was weighed down by some invisible force. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am in need of your assistance, Mr. Holmes. What I have to share is of the utmost importance. Lives are at stake." Holmes studied him intently, his sharp eyes never leaving the man's face. "Go on." Jonathan Hale paused for a moment, glancing at Watson before fixing his gaze back on the detective. "I come from the financial world, Mr. Holmes, more specifically Wall Street in New York City. You see, there is something sinister happening in the heart of the financial markets. I believe that powerful individuals are manipulating the stock market for their own gain, in ways that are too intricate and too dangerous to be left unchecked." Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but Watson could sense the flicker of interest in the detective's eyes. This was no ordinary case. The financial world, after all, was a realm far removed from the typical cases that came to Holmes. Murder, theft, and blackmail were his usual fare, things that could be explained, contained, and solved with logic. But this was something altogether different. "Manipulating the stock market?" Holmes repeated, his voice calm but laced with curiosity. "And how exactly are these individuals going about this manipulation?" Hale leaned forward, his hands now trembling visibly. "There is a conspiracy, Mr. Holmes, a conspiracy so vast that it spans continents. I've recently learned of a secret syndicate, a group of powerful figures who have been orchestrating a series of market crashes and artificial inflation of stocks. They use insider information, bribery, and manipulation of market trends to control the financial landscape. And, Mr. Holmes, it is not only the banks and firms that are affected. There are lives at stake, people losing everything they have worked for. The entire system is being exploited for the gain of a select few." Watson looked between Holmes and Hale, sensing that the weight of the situation was heavy for both men. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, eyes distant as though pondering the depth of the case. "Quite a claim," Holmes said after a long pause. "And what brings you here, Mr. Hale? Why come to me with this? Surely someone in your position, someone so deeply embedded in the financial world, could handle such matters on your own." Hale looked away, his gaze distant. "I tried," he said softly. "I tried to speak to the authorities in New York, but the higher I went, the more I realized that those who could help were all involved in some way. I've been threatened, Mr. Holmes. My colleagues have disappeared. One man, an associate of mine, a banker named Samuel Montgomery, went missing 2 weeks ago after he told me something that I can't bring myself to say aloud." Hale's voice trailed off, the fear evident in his eyes. Holmes's expression softened ever so slightly, but only for a moment. His sharp mind was already processing the pieces of the puzzle. This was no ordinary business affair. This was a case where the stakes were far greater than mere money. Hale's fear was palpable, and the missing associate only added to the mystery. "Tell me more about Montgomery," Holmes said, his voice steady, "and why you believe this conspiracy reaches as far as it does." Hale nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before continuing. Montgomery was one of the top traders at one of the largest banks in New York. He had access to information, financial secrets, that no one outside of the boardroom should have known. He came to me 2 weeks ago with a warning. He had uncovered something huge, but before he could explain further, he vanished. I've since been followed, watched, and threatened. My life is in danger, Mr. Holmes, and I believe that Montgomery's disappearance is linked to this conspiracy. But it goes beyond that, beyond what even I can understand. Holmes studied Hale for a long moment, his piercing gaze unblinking. Finally, he spoke. "You say lives are at stake. What exactly do you mean by that?" Hale looked down at his hands, his voice barely audible. "People are being ruined, Mr. Holmes. Families are losing everything. Investors, workers, the average man and woman on the street. They are being used as pawns in a game that only the rich and powerful can play. It's not just about money. It's about control, power over lives, over entire nations. And I fear that if it continues, it will only get worse." Watson, who had been silently observing the conversation, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had never heard his friend speak so seriously about a case before. There was something in Hale's words that rang true, a gravity to the situation that made it feel more dangerous than any typical criminal act. Holmes remained silent for a long time, his eyes narrowed in thought. He had solved countless mysteries over the years, but this was something unlike anything he had encountered before. The world of finance, with its intricacies and complexities, was a challenge even for his sharp mind. Yet the severity of the case, the threat to innocent lives, and the possibility of a vast conspiracy were enough to pull him in. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice firm. "Very well, Mr. Hale, I will take your case. But I must warn you, this will not be easy. The forces you are up against are powerful and far-reaching. You must be prepared for what lies ahead." Hale nodded, relief flooding his face. "I will do anything, Mr. Holmes. Anything." With that, Holmes rose from his chair, his mind already racing through possibilities, calculations, and patterns. Watson could see that his friend had already slipped into the mindset of the detective he was known to be. The mind that could solve the most complex of mysteries with razor-sharp precision. "Watson," Holmes said, turning to him, "pack your bags. We are going to New York." And with that, the game was afoot. As the days passed, the fog that had hung so thickly over London began to lift, but the sense of foreboding that had gripped Sherlock Holmes did not dissipate. His mind had already begun the intricate process of unraveling the tangled web that Hale had described. The financial world, so distant from the usual shadows of crime and investigation Holmes dealt with, seemed like a strange and dangerous new frontier. Yet, as always, Holmes embraced the challenge with his usual intensity. Packing had begun almost immediately, with Watson assisting in his own particular, ever-so-precise way. Despite the magnitude of the case, Holmes remained his usual composed self, but the faintest trace of excitement lingered behind his calculating gaze. Watson, on the other hand, felt a mixture of concern and curiosity. The case felt unlike anything they had handled before. There was something about the idea of an invisible enemy manipulating entire economies, with the power to ruin lives and erase fortunes, that struck a chord deep within him. By the time they were ready to depart, the wind was sharp, cutting through the streets of London with a cruel bite. The train ride to the port was a quiet one, with Holmes lost in thought looking out the window as the landscape blurred by. Watson, in contrast, could barely contain his thoughts and questions, though he knew better than to interrupt Holmes when he was focused. The detective's mind was a labyrinth, and it often took days, sometimes even weeks, for all the pieces to fall into place. But Watson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something told him that this case, with its shadows of wealth and manipulation, would be far more dangerous than they anticipated. The journey to New York was long, and the constant hum of the ship's engines only seemed to amplify the tension that hung between them. Holmes spent most of the time studying various books on finance and economic theory, though he rarely referred to the material directly. To Watson, it was clear that Holmes wasn't reading to learn but to understand, to absorb the mechanics of a system that had long been foreign to him. The detective's mind worked like a finely tuned instrument, and even in the quiet moments he was already formulating a theory. They arrived in New York amidst the sharp skyline, where towering buildings stretched upwards like the jagged teeth of a great beast. The city was alive with noise, people rushing in every direction, carriages clattering against cobblestone streets, the constant hum of industry pressing against every corner. The air was thick with ambition, the very fabric of the city woven tightly around the ever-turning gears of commerce. But Holmes and Watson, as always, were not concerned with the outward trappings of the city. They had come for a purpose. Hale had made arrangements for their stay in a discreet, quiet hotel near Wall Street, the beating heart of New York's financial district. From their window, Holmes could see the glittering skyscrapers that housed the city's power brokers, men and women whose names were whispered in boardrooms and whose decisions shaped the lives of millions. For all the wealth and grandeur, however, Holmes saw only the intricate dance of shadows, the subtle threads of manipulation and control that ran beneath the surface. There were no accidents in this world. Every movement, every action was calculated. The following day, Hale led them through the maze of Wall Street. The streets were crowded with businessmen, investors, and brokers hurrying from one deal to the next. It was a city of power, a city of money where the balance of wealth shifted on the whims of a few. Holmes and Watson entered a bank that Hale had recommended. The building was grand, its marble floors gleaming under the chandeliers, its walls adorned with portraits of men long dead, who had once been at the helm of this great financial empire. Hale led them to a back office where they would meet with a trusted colleague of his, a banker by the name of Edward Hollis. Hollis, a man in his late 40s with a sharply cut suit and graying hair, looked more the part of a corporate giant than someone whose interests might align with a mystery-solving detective. He greeted them with the careful politeness one might expect in such an establishment, but there was a hint of apprehension behind his eyes, something Holmes did not miss. "Mr. Hale tells me you are investigating a rather delicate matter," Hollis said, motioning for them to sit. His tone was careful, measured, as if he was treading lightly in unfamiliar territory. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice calm yet tinged with an underlying edge of authority. "I understand that you are familiar with the goings-on of the financial world here, Mr. Hollis. You also, I gather, have some concerns regarding irregularities in the market." Hollis hesitated before nodding. "I do, though I am not certain how much I can share without stepping into dangerous waters. The market, Mr. Holmes, is not what it once was. There are whispers, rumors. Some of them may be true. Some may be nothing more than fear-mongering. But recently there have been signs, small at first, but growing, of a manipulation of stock prices, of inside information being used to artificially inflate and deflate shares." Holmes's eyes narrowed as he absorbed Hollis's words. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled under his chin. "And you believe these irregularities are connected to the conspiracy that Mr. Hale mentioned?" Hollis's gaze flickered briefly to Hale, then back to Holmes. I can't say for sure, but there is something wrong here, Mr. Holmes. Something sinister. When Montgomery disappeared, he was working on something that would have exposed the manipulation. I fear that the same forces that control the market have their hands in everything." "And how deep does this go?" Watson asked, his voice laced with the curiosity that had been building since their arrival. Hollis glanced nervously around the room before answering in a hushed tone. "It goes to the top, Dr. Watson. Powerful people are involved. The kind of people who can make or break economies with the flick of a pen. And when you're at the top, there are very few who will ask questions. It is all kept very contained. But the cracks are beginning to show. Montgomery's disappearance was just the beginning." Holmes's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Hale had mentioned that people were losing everything, that innocent individuals were being hurt by forces far beyond their control. The missing banker, Montgomery, was the key to unraveling the whole conspiracy. But where could Holmes begin? In a world where the rules were hidden behind complex financial jargon and market manipulation, how could one even start to uncover the truth? As if sensing his thoughts, Hale spoke. Mr. Holmes Montgomery left behind a series of records, notes, ledgers, things that he believed would help expose the conspiracy. They were hidden in his office before he vanished, but no one has been able to make sense of them. Holmes's eyes lit up at the mention of the records. It was the break they needed, the missing link that could connect all the pieces. "I want to see these records," Holmes said, his voice firm with the quiet certainty that only he possessed. Immediately, Hollis hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "I will take you to the office. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, the deeper you dig, the more dangerous it becomes." Holmes stood up, his gaze never wavering. "Danger is what I do best." With that, the three of them left the opulent bank and made their way to the building where Montgomery had once worked. The streets of Wall Street felt different now, darker, more oppressive, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes, Watson, and Hale entered the building, their footsteps echoing ominously on the polished floors. As they ascended in the elevator to the top floor, Watson could sense the change in Holmes. The detective's posture had straightened, his mind already calculating the next move. He was ready to confront whatever lay ahead, to unmask the dark forces that had been manipulating the lives of thousands. And as the doors of the elevator opened to Montgomery's office, Holmes's gaze hardened, knowing that this was just the beginning of a far more dangerous game than he had ever played before. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and the trio stepped out into the dimly lit hallway of the building's top floor. The quiet buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to echo the growing tension in the air. Holmes, with his customary precision, moved forward without hesitation, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of disturbance or hidden clues. Watson, less accustomed to the shadows of Wall Street, lingered behind, trying to make sense of the situation unfolding around them. Hale, who had been walking silently by Holmes's side, led them to a door near the far end of the hall. It was unassuming, the kind of door one might expect in an office building, yet to Holmes it felt like the threshold to a mystery far darker than the financial world he had been thrust into. He glanced at Hale, whose tense posture betrayed his unease. "This is it," Hale said softly, his voice tight. "Montgomery's office." Holmes didn't respond immediately, instead giving the door a cursory glance before pushing it open. The room beyond was sparsely furnished, yet there was a certain air of order to it. A desk, an old-fashioned leather chair behind it, and several filing cabinets lined the walls. There were no grandiose gestures of wealth here, no marble countertops or gilded picture frames, but instead a quiet, almost sterile sense of purpose. Hale stepped into the room first, and with a single motion, he reached into the drawer of the desk. It creaked open, revealing a small stack of papers, each one carefully stacked but with the faintest hint of wear at the edges. "These are his notes," Hale said, pushing them toward Holmes. He was working on something he never had the chance to finish. Holmes, with an almost imperceptible nod, reached for the papers. His eyes flicked over them, scanning quickly. He didn't speak for several long moments, his brow furrowed as he absorbed the contents. The pages were filled with numbers, financial terms, and detailed charts, some familiar, others less so. But scattered throughout the mess of data were strange symbols, codes that didn't seem to fit. Watson stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "What is this, Holmes?" Holmes didn't look up as he flipped through the papers, his fingers moving with quick precision. "It appears to be a form of encryption, Watson. These are not just ordinary financial records. Montgomery had uncovered something hidden beneath the surface of the numbers." A small chart caught Holmes's attention. He paused for a moment, examining it with intense focus. The chart depicted a series of rising and falling stock prices, but there was a marked pattern within the fluctuations. It was subtle yet unmistakable, an artificial manipulation of the market causing the prices to shift in such a way that no ordinary investor could ever expect. Holmes's fingers traced the lines of the chart, his mind already working through the implications. "This is it," Holmes murmured almost to himself. Montgomery had figured out the timing of these market manipulations, but he was close to uncovering something far more dangerous. The mention of danger made Hale stiffen. "You see it too, then? This is no ordinary manipulation. These aren't simple fluctuations. It's coordinated, systematic." Holmes looked up at Hale, his expression hardening. "Indeed. But there's more here than meets the eye. The manipulations aren't just financial, they're deliberate, orchestrated. Someone is pulling the strings, carefully controlling every aspect. This isn't merely for profit. It's about power. Power over entire economies. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Watson felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about money. This was a conspiracy that could affect the entire world. His thoughts turned to the people who were losing everything, to those whose lives were being ruined by unseen hands. Holmes turned back to the papers, flipping to a page that seemed out of place. A series of cryptic numbers and letters were scrawled in the margin, the handwriting shaky as if Montgomery had been in a hurry when he wrote them. Holmes' eyes narrowed as he read the sequence aloud. C1X9B8L3. Watson glanced at the paper, his mind struggling to make sense of the jumble. Is this some kind of code? Holmes nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yes, it's a cipher, and I believe it's a key. Perhaps a location or a time, something tied to this conspiracy. Hale stepped closer, his face pale. I didn't know about this. Montgomery never mentioned a cipher to me, but I do know that he was worried about something. He thought they were watching him, following him. He said that if anything happened to him, these papers would be the key. Holmes looked up from the papers, his gaze piercing. They are watching you, Mr. Hale, and now they are watching us. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and the weight of the situation settled on all three men. There were unseen forces at work, forces far beyond their control. Holmes had no illusions about the danger they were in. This wasn't just about uncovering a financial conspiracy. This was about exposing a network of power so vast that it could bring entire nations to their knees. Holmes folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the drawer. We need to get back to my hotel. I need time to think. Time to decode the cipher and figure out what Montgomery was trying to tell us. The three of them left the office quickly, with Hale leading the way through the labyrinthine hallways of the building. As they stepped into the elevator, Holmes's mind raced. He needed more time, more information, but the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind this conspiracy would stop at nothing to protect their secret. As the elevator descended, Holmes felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were being watched, and it was only a matter of time before those who wanted to protect their secrets would take action. The game had changed and the stakes were higher than ever. When they reached the ground floor, Holmes led Watson and Hale out of the building and into the bustling streets of Wall Street. The noise, the thrumming energy of the city seemed almost oppressive. But Holmes was unbothered by the chaos. His mind was already far beyond the streets of New York, far beyond the distractions of the world around him. He was focusing on the cipher, on the numbers and letters that Montgomery had left behind. What did they mean? What was he trying to uncover? Hale, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. Do you think they'll come after us? Whoever's behind this? Holmes gave him a cold, calculating look. If they haven't already, they will. We're not dealing with ordinary criminals, Mr. Hale. These people have power, influence. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets. As they walked toward the hotel, Holmes's thoughts were fixed on the cipher. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align, but the full picture remained just out of reach. They were on the edge of something far bigger than they had anticipated. And with every step, Holmes could feel the danger closing in around them. The hotel was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Holmes and Watson made their way to their room with Hale trailing behind them. Once inside, Holmes immediately began spreading the papers across the desk, scrutinizing them once more. His fingers danced over the cipher, trying to make sense of the cryptic code. Watson stood silently, watching as Holmes worked. He could see the familiar intensity in his friend's eyes, the same focus that had led them through so many cases before. But there was something different this time, something deeper. Holmes was on the edge of something, and Watson could feel the urgency building. After what felt like hours, Holmes suddenly stopped, his eyes widening as a realization struck him. He grabbed a pen and began to write the cipher on a blank piece of paper, his hand moving swiftly. I have it, Holmes said, his voice almost a whisper. This is not just a random sequence. It's a map to a location. Watson leaned over his shoulder, trying to make sense of the words and numbers. Where does it lead? Holmes's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. To the heart of the conspiracy, Watson. To the place where it all began. And with that, Holmes stood up, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. We leave first thing in the morning. The game is afoot, and now we shall see how deep this rabbit hole truly goes. The early morning air in New York was brisk, with a faint chill that hinted at the coming of autumn. Holmes, ever the early riser, was already dressed and pacing the small hotel room, his mind brimming with the revelations from the night before. Watson, still groggy from lack of sleep, had reluctantly dragged himself from bed, his eyes struggling to focus on the events unfolding around him. The cipher, the map, the pieces of the puzzle were starting to click together. Holmes had stayed up late into the night, his mind working furiously to decipher the code Montgomery had left behind. At times, Watson had seen his friend muttering to himself, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pieced together the cryptic numbers and letters. And then, with a sudden flare of insight, Holmes had looked up, a small, satisfied smile playing across his face. The puzzle had fallen into place. The cipher wasn't just a location. It was a set of coordinates, a set of directions leading to an old, decrepit building on the outskirts of the city, near the river. It had once been a prominent shipping warehouse, but now it stood abandoned, its windows shattered and its doors hanging off their hinges. It was the kind of place that seemed to hold secrets in its very walls, a perfect hiding place for those who wanted to operate in the shadows. "We leave immediately," Holmes had said after explaining his breakthrough. "We cannot waste any more time." Now, as the two men stood in the dim light of the early morning, their plan was set. Holmes had already packed his usual minimal belongings, ready to face whatever waited at the coordinates Montgomery had so carefully hidden. Watson, always cautious, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, mixed with the nagging sensation that something was about to go terribly wrong. He had seen enough of Holmes' cases to know that the more intricate and dangerous they became, the more likely they were to end in violence. And this felt like the beginning of something far worse. Hale, who had been pacing nervously near the door, turned toward them. His face was ashen, eyes wide with worry. "Do you really think this is the right place? What if it's a trap?" Holmes glanced at him, his expression hardening. "I don't believe in traps, Mr. Hale. I believe in facts. And the facts lead us here." The three men made their way to a nearby carriage which had been arranged by Hale, who had insisted on staying in the background. His involvement, though critical, had only taken him so far. Now it was up to Holmes and Watson to see the case through. Hale's face bore the faint trace of fear, but his resolve was firm. He had no choice but to trust Holmes. And if Montgomery's disappearance had been any indication, there was no turning back now. The carriage ride was long, taking them through the heart of New York's bustling streets before venturing into the quieter, more industrial areas near the river. The city's grandeur gave way to the faded and decaying remnants of its industrial past. Old warehouses stood like ghosts of a bygone era, their rusted metal frames and crumbling brick facades telling tales of wealth once generated by trade. Now many of these buildings were abandoned, forgotten by those who had once relied on them. And at the end of one such street, in the midst of the derelict buildings, stood the warehouse, the one that had appeared on Montgomery's map. The structure loomed before them, its dark silhouette cutting through the early morning mist. A single light burned dimly in one of the top windows, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of salt and oil, the scent of the river mixing with the rot of decay. The warehouse seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it were waiting for them to arrive. Holmes didn't hesitate. He led the way, his steps purposeful, his eyes scanning the surroundings with his usual intense scrutiny. Watson, though his instincts screamed caution, followed closely behind. The chill in the air seemed to seep into their bones, but neither of them shivered. They were too focused on the task at hand. They reached the large rusted doors of the warehouse, and Holmes gave them a cursory inspection. "It's been years since anyone's used this place," he muttered, his fingers tracing the grooves of the door's metal. "The decay is intentional, I suspect. This place was meant to be forgotten." Holmes pulled at the door, and it creaked open with a groan, revealing the dark interior. A musty, stale odor wafted out, and the faint sounds of dripping water echoed from deep within the building. There was no sign of movement, but Holmes's sharp eyes caught the glint of something metallic in the dim light. He motioned for Watson to follow, and the two of them stepped inside, with Hale trailing cautiously behind them. The interior of the warehouse was a cavernous space, its high ceiling supported by rusting beams. The floor was littered with debris, broken crates, shards of glass, and pieces of old machinery. The shadows stretched far and wide, making it difficult to discern what lay ahead. But Holmes's gaze was sharp, his mind already at work. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning every corner, every surface. "There's something here," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "The question is, what exactly are we looking for?" Before Watson could respond, a soft, almost imperceptible noise reached their ears. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. The three men froze, their bodies tensing instinctively. Watson's hand went to the revolver tucked in his coat, but Holmes stopped him with a quick motion. "It's not an enemy," Holmes said, his voice low. Not yet. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then from the shadows a figure appeared, tall with a heavy coat that billowed slightly as he moved. The figure's face was obscured by the low light, but there was no mistaking the air of authority he exuded. He stopped a few paces from Holmes, his posture rigid. "You found it, then?" the man said, his voice rich with a slight foreign accent. "I wondered how long it would take you." Holmes studied the man carefully, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "I trust you are the one responsible for this operation?" The man chuckled softly, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. "Responsible? No, Mr. Holmes, I am merely a facilitator, but I suppose that is the same thing in your line of work, isn't it?" Watson bristled at the man's dismissive tone, but Holmes remained unflappable. "Then you are the one I need to speak to. I've been following the trail of destruction you've left in your wake. The manipulated markets, the lives ruined. You've taken far too much from innocent people." The man's smile faded slightly, his gaze growing cold. "Innocent? Mr. Holmes, you are naive. You have no idea how the world works. In this game, there are no innocents, only pawns. You and your friend here are no different. You've come to play your part." Holmes tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "I'm not interested in playing games. I'm here to end this." At that moment, the silence in the room was broken by the faintest sound of movement from behind the figure. Holmes's eyes flicked to the side, noting the subtle shift. The figure turned slightly as though aware of the presence, but did not react. "End this?" the man mused, his eyes gleaming. "You think you can stop something that is already in motion?" "You are too late, Mr. Holmes, too late by far." Holmes's expression hardened, and in that instant everything shifted. He knew the truth now. The game was no longer just about exposing financial corruption. It was about stopping a force that had already spread too far. With a swift motion, Holmes turned, his hand outstretched to Watson. "Get ready." This man isn't working alone. Before Watson could react, the figure lunged toward them, a sudden, swift move that left no time to hesitate. Holmes had anticipated it, however, and sidestepped in the same fluid motion, pushing Watson back just in time. The figure's attack missed, but Holmes had already set his trap. In the seconds that followed, the room seemed to narrow, the air thick with the promise of danger. Holmes' voice cut through the tension. "The game has changed. Now we play for our lives." And just like that, the true nature of the conspiracy revealed itself. A war of wills, where power, secrecy, and survival were the only rules. The room seemed to constrict with every passing second, the silence hanging heavily in the air as the man who had appeared from the shadows stood with his back to them, his posture stiff with a dangerous resolve. Holmes, ever the master of strategy, had already assessed the situation, his mind working at lightning speed, calculating the next move. Watson, though his hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his side, followed Holmes's lead. The danger was palpable, but in moments like this, Holmes's composure was their only weapon. The figure in front of them was no ordinary man. His words, his demeanor, they were those of someone accustomed to being in control, to playing games of influence and power with lives as mere pawns. Holmes had seen this type before, men who thought they were untouchable because they operated from the shadows, pulling strings from afar. This man, however, had made one grave mistake. He had underestimated Holmes. "You think you've won?" the man said, his voice calm but with an unmistakable undercurrent of menace. "You think you can stop this? But you're too late. The system is already in motion, and there's nothing you can do to stop it now." Holmes studied him carefully, his sharp eyes narrowing. "That's where you're wrong," Holmes replied evenly. "I'm not here to stop a system. I'm here to dismantle it piece by piece, and you, my friend, are the first piece." The figure's lips curled into a sardonic smile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You're an idealist. This isn't a game, Holmes. This is power, and power, once it's in motion, doesn't stop." The words were intended to provoke, to rattle Holmes's resolve, but they failed. The detective's mind was already far beyond this moment, already calculating the moves that would bring this conspiracy to its knees. What this man failed to understand was that power, in its most corrupt and insidious form, was always vulnerable to the truth, and Holmes had just uncovered a key part of that truth. The man stepped forward suddenly, breaking the stillness, his hand reaching inside his coat. In an instant, Holmes's body tensed, his instincts screaming that something was about to unfold. But instead of the expected weapon, the man pulled out a small leather-bound book. He tossed it onto the ground between them, the pages fluttering open. "This is the ledger," the man said coldly. "The final piece of the puzzle. You think you can stop me? You think you can stop them? You have no idea what you're up against." Holmes crouched down, his fingers carefully flipping through the pages of the ledger. The handwriting was meticulous, each entry precise, almost as if it were a script designed to hide the true nature of the information. But Holmes could see through it, his mind effortlessly deciphering the coded language buried within. Watson watched from a few steps back, his nerves taut as the silence stretched on. He had learned long ago that when Holmes was focused like this, there was little use in asking questions. Everything would unfold in time. As Holmes read, his face grew darker with each line. The ledger was far more than just a record of financial transactions. It was a blueprint for the conspiracy, a plan so vast, so intricately woven into the very fabric of the world's financial systems that it seemed impossible to dismantle. The names, the figures, the dates, all of it pointed to something much larger than just Wall Street. It was a global network, a shadow economy that operated without regard for borders, for laws, or for human lives. "This is it," Holmes said softly, his voice tinged with a rare sense of both awe and disgust. "This is the foundation of the entire operation." The figure in front of them did not respond. Instead, he remained silent, watching with a strange mix of anticipation and resignation. It was clear he knew they were beginning to see the full scope of the situation. Perhaps for the first time he was realizing just how close he was to losing control. "Who is behind this?" Watson asked, his voice low but charged with urgency. He had no time for games anymore. The truth needed to come out, and fast. "Who are the people you're working for?" The figure's eyes flickered for a brief moment, just a flash of uncertainty, and then he stepped back, his gaze hardening. "You think it's just one person? You think it's that simple? There is no singular mastermind. There are many, too many to name, too many to catch." Holmes straightened, his expression unchanging. "You're wrong. There's always a singular mastermind. And you, my friend, are just a pawn in a much larger game." The man chuckled darkly. "You really think you can bring them down? You a detective? You think you can just waltz in and expose what's taken years to build?" "I don't think," Holmes replied coolly. "I know." There was a long pause. The figure's posture shifted, as if considering the possibility that Holmes was more than just an irritating obstacle. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You'll never get out of here alive." "None of you will." Before Watson could react, Holmes moved with fluid precision, grabbing the ledger and tossing it to him. "Take it, we're leaving." The figure lunged, but Holmes had already anticipated the move. In a single, swift motion, Holmes stepped aside, sending the man crashing into a pile of rusted crates. He barely had time to regain his balance before Holmes, with surprising speed, pressed a sharp object against his neck, a makeshift knife fashioned from one of the discarded pieces of machinery. The man froze, his face contorting with frustration and surprise. For a moment he seemed to consider making a move, but then the realization dawned on him. There was no escaping, not now. Holmes leaned in closer, his voice a low, menacing whisper. "I suggest you stay very still. We're leaving, and you're not in a position to stop us." The man's breath hitched in his throat, but he said nothing. His eyes darted between Holmes, Watson, and the shadowy corners of the warehouse, as if contemplating his next move. But the weight of Holmes's presence, his certainty, his authority, drove any thought of resistance from his mind. "Watson," Holmes said, never taking his eyes off the man, "get the car ready. We'll need to leave quickly." Watson nodded, his hand still hovering near the revolver, but his attention now split between the unfolding scene and the necessity of their escape. Without a word, he turned and moved toward the entrance of the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew better than to question Holmes's instincts, especially when they were so sharply honed in moments of danger. He could feel the tension in the air, the feeling of impending confrontation, but he knew that Holmes had the situation under control. As Watson moved toward the exit, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the large space, Holmes maintained his grip on the man, never wavering. The man shifted slightly, his posture stiff, but he remained silent. It was as if he had accepted that the game was over, at least for now. Then with a sudden, jarring motion, the figure tried to make one last desperate attempt, lunging toward Holmes. But Holmes, ever the step ahead, sidestepped with ease, his hand pressing the sharp metal against the man's throat once again. "I warned you," Holmes said, his voice cold as ice. The man staggered back, fear flooding his features for the first time. His eyes locked onto Holmes's with a mix of hate and resignation. "You may have won this round, Holmes," he spat, "but you'll never defeat what's coming. You'll never see the full picture." Holmes, his eyes steely, tightened his grip. "I don't need to see the full picture. I just need to find the pieces. And once I do, I will burn this entire network to the ground." With that, Holmes stepped back, allowing the man to fall to his knees in defeat. He turned toward Watson, who had returned and was now standing at the doorway, the light from the outside casting long shadows across the floor. "We've got what we came for, Watson," Holmes said, his tone decisive. "Now it's time to finish what we started." And with that, they made their way out of the warehouse, leaving the man, defeated, but not yet broken, behind. But Holmes knew that this was only the beginning. The conspiracy was far from over. There were more pieces to uncover, more shadows to chase. And in the end, it was not just the system they were fighting. It was the very heart of power itself. As they left the warehouse, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a new light on the path ahead. The game had shifted and the stakes had never been higher. The early morning light washed over the skyline of New York as Holmes and Watson made their way down the streets, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, dampened air. The chill of the morning was still heavy, but the tension between the two men felt even colder. There was an unspoken understanding that the events of the previous night had set them on a path from which there would be no return. They had escaped the warehouse, barely. Holmes had been right. The man they'd confronted, though seemingly powerless in that moment, had left a mark, a warning on them both. The streets felt different now. The weight of the knowledge they'd uncovered, the ledger, the names, the corruption that ran through the veins of global finance, hung over them like a storm cloud. They were no longer chasing shadows. They were standing at the precipice, ready to confront the people who controlled the very fabric of society. As they walked, Holmes' mind raced. He had seen the patterns, the connections between the figures and dates in the ledger. It was more than just an economic conspiracy. It was a force that had woven itself into the world's power structures. Governments, corporations, financial institutions, they were all complicit in the machinations. The real question was, who was pulling the strings? Watson, walking beside him, glanced at his friend, his mind still reeling from the chaos of the previous night. "Holmes," he began cautiously, "what do you think they meant when he said, 'You'll never see the full picture'?" Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, his expression unreadable. "It's a warning, Watson, but also a confession. The network is much larger than we've anticipated. The people behind it are not just in finance. They are in every corner of society, embedded in the very institutions we trust. What we uncovered at the warehouse is only the beginning." Watson fell silent, his thoughts spinning. He had seen Holmes go after criminals before. He had seen his friend face danger without flinching. But this felt different. The scale of it, the reach of the conspiracy, was something far beyond the usual cases Holmes solved. It wasn't just about catching a criminal. It was about stopping a machine that ran on a global scale, one that was designed to crush anyone who tried to expose it. They reached the hotel, the building standing in stark contrast to the grimness of the streets around it. Holmes paused in front of the door, his hand resting on the handle but his eyes still distant. "We need to act quickly, Watson. We've stirred the hornet's nest. If we don't expose this soon, it will disappear back into the shadows. These people, whoever they are, will stop at nothing to protect their empire." Watson nodded grimly. He had seen Holmes face off against the most dangerous criminals in the world, but this felt like a war, Inside the hotel room, Holmes immediately went to work. He spread the contents of the ledger across the table once again, his eyes flicking back and forth as he examined the cryptic notations, the names, the codes that had become so familiar to him. It was clear now. There were multiple layers to the conspiracy. What they had uncovered in the warehouse wasn't just a map to a hidden fortune. It was a blueprint for a global system, a structure built on exploitation and control, a machine that had been running for decades, maybe even centuries. "There's more," Holmes muttered under his breath as he scanned the ledger. "There are names here, Watson. Names of people who hold the keys to everything. If we can find them, we can expose the whole operation. But we must be careful. Whoever controls this network is watching every move we make." Watson looked at his friend, concern etched on his face. "What's our next step?" Holmes stood up abruptly, his eyes focused with a rare intensity. "We need to meet with Hale. He's the only one who can help us get closer to the heart of this. He knows the players involved, and he's been in the thick of it for too long to be unaware of the scope of what's happening. We'll confront him, but we must be prepared. There are forces at play that we cannot yet comprehend." The two men left the hotel, their steps quick and purposeful. They made their way through the city streets, each step echoing louder in Holmes' mind. The game was now in motion, and there was no turning back. They reached Hale's office, a tall glass building that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the grimness of their mission. Hale's office was on the top floor, and as they ascended in the elevator, Holmes didn't speak. He was too deep in thought, his mind already calculating the possible outcomes. Hale, the man who had first brought them into this world, had been their guide, their connection to the world of Wall Street. But Holmes was no fool. He knew that Hale had his own secrets, secrets that might either be an asset or a dangerous complication. When the elevator doors opened, Hale stood waiting for them, his face tense as if he knew something had shifted. "You've been busy," he said, his voice laced with a hint of apprehension. Holmes didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Hale, we need the truth. All of it, no more games. The ledger we found at the warehouse, it's a blueprint for a global network, one that has infiltrated every corner of society. Names, figures, dates, all of it points to something far more dangerous than anything we anticipated. You know more about this than you've let on." Hale shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the window as if weighing his options. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to involve you, Holmes. I didn't want to pull you into this. But now that you're in, there's no turning back. The people we're dealing with, they're not just businessmen. They're something else. Powerful men and women who pull the strings from behind closed doors, controlling everything from governments to economies. They don't care about individuals. They care about control, about dominance." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes hard. "Who are they, Hale? Who are the people behind this?" Hale hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering between Holmes and Watson. "They call themselves the Consortium, a secret society, made up of the world's most influential figures. It's not just about money. It's about reshaping the world into something they can control. An oligarchy where the rich rule and the rest of us are nothing more than pawns in their game. They've been manipulating markets, governments, and even entire nations for years, and they're untouchable. No one can stop them." Watson's voice was edged with disbelief. "You're saying that these people have been pulling the strings of global events for decades? And you didn't think to tell us sooner?" Hale's eyes darkened. "I had no choice. I couldn't risk exposing myself, not when the stakes are this high. The Consortium has eyes everywhere. One wrong move and they'll take everything from you. They'll destroy you." Holmes took a deep breath, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was far more terrifying than he had imagined. The Consortium wasn't just a group of corrupt businessmen. It was a shadow organization manipulating the very fabric of society. And Hale, for all his involvement, was still just a cog in their machine. "We need to take them down," Holmes said, his voice cold with determination. "We can't let this continue. They must be stopped." Hale nodded, his face grim. "I agree. But we can't do this alone. They have resources, connections, people who would kill to keep their secrets safe. You'll need to get inside, Holmes. You'll need to find the heart of the Consortium, expose it for the world to see." Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes sharp. "We'll need access. To the Consortium's meetings, to their leaders. It's time we put everything on the line." Hale hesitated again before speaking. I can give you access to a few of their key members. But be careful. They'll be watching. Always. The tension in the room was palpable as the weight of their next step settled in. They were no longer simply investigating a financial conspiracy. They were about to go up against a global power structure. And as Holmes looked at Hale, he knew that this was just the beginning. They were on the brink of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Holmes straightened, his mind already turning to their next move. We'll take them down, Hale. But first we need to gather more information. We need to be sure of who they are, where they are, and what they're planning next. Once we have that, we'll strike. Hale nodded, his face pale. Good luck. You'll need it. As Holmes and Watson left the office, their minds were already focused on the next phase of their plan. The consortium was powerful, its reach vast, but Holmes had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had faced greater dangers before, and he would face this one too. But this time the stakes were higher. This time it wasn't just about solving a case. It was about dismantling a system built on lies, deception, and control. And Holmes knew that in order to expose the truth, he would have to walk a fine line between being the hunter and becoming the hunted. The game had shifted. The real battle was just beginning, you said. The morning had come too quickly for both Holmes and Watson. The stakes had never been higher, the danger never more immediate. They had spent days gathering their wits, scrutinizing the ledger, plotting their next moves. But now, in the dim light of the early hours, it was time to act. Holmes sat at the window of their hotel room, staring out at the city that had been his battleground for the last few days. The faint hum of New York life below was barely audible as he contemplated the final move. The consortium, this vast network of influence, corruption, and greed, had been a shadow lurking behind every action they had taken. They had almost been too careful, too precise in their operations. But the ledger, the cryptic notes, and the faces they had encountered had given them the final pieces to the puzzle. Now it was time to bring the shadow into the light. Watson, Holmes said, his voice steady yet tinged with an intensity that was unusual for him. We've reached the tipping point. If we strike now, there's no turning back. The consortium will retaliate. Of that I have no doubt. But the truth will finally come to light. Watson, standing near the door with his coat in hand, gave a quick nod. I'm ready, Holmes. You know I'm with you. But where do we go from here? Holmes turned, a flicker of determination crossing his face. We have one last lead, Hale's contact. They are meeting today, in an undisclosed location, to finalize their next move. We need to be there, Watson. We'll expose them, take down their network, and with any luck leave nothing but ruin in our wake. The plan was simple, but its execution would not be easy. Holmes had arranged to meet with Hale's contact, a high-ranking member of the consortium, under the guise of a secret meeting to discuss an investment opportunity. If everything went according to plan, they would walk into the lion's den armed only with their wits and leave with the evidence they needed to unravel the entire operation. The two men made their way to the location, a discreet building on the outskirts of the city, hidden among a row of seemingly nondescript warehouses. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the entrance. The game was nearing its end. Every step was a calculated risk, but Holmes, with his unwavering focus, moved forward with a confidence that made Watson's nerves steadier. Inside the building was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as they made their way deeper into the building, following the directions Hale had provided. They reached a door marked only by a simple number, 304. Holmes paused before opening it, giving Watson one last glance. Once we step through, there's no going back, Holmes said quietly. Watson nodded. I understand. With that, Holmes opened the door. The room was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the sterile halls they had just walked through. At the far end of the room stood a tall, shadowy figure, Hale's contact. The man was impeccably dressed, his face obscured by the shadows, his posture commanding. Holmes wasted no time. We're here to end this, he said, his voice unwavering, projecting the authority that had become second nature to him. The man smiled, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling calm. You think you can stop us? You two men with nothing but a few stolen documents and a pipe dream? Holmes' eyes never wavered from the man. We've already won. The truth is out. You can run, but the world will see your corruption for what it is. It's over. The man chuckled darkly. You may have gathered pieces of the puzzle, Holmes, but you're too late. The consortium's reach is far greater than you realize. Even if you expose us, it won't matter. The wheels of power are in motion. You think you're the only ones who know the game? You're just a part of it. Before Holmes could respond, the door slammed shut behind them and the room was flooded with light. A dozen armed men appeared, surrounding them in an instant. Watson's hand shot to his revolver, but Holmes stayed his hand with a simple gesture. "Stay calm, Watson," Holmes said softly, his eyes darting around the room. "This is what we expected." The leader of the armed men stepped forward, a sinister grin on his face. "You've made a grave mistake, Holmes. The consortium doesn't lose." Holmes didn't flinch. "You're wrong. The truth doesn't lose, and the truth will be known." Without warning, Holmes reached into his coat, pulling out a small device, a recorder. "I have everything I need. The world will know what you've done." The man's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think this will change anything?" "I know it will," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "The truth is unstoppable." Before anyone could react, Holmes tossed the recorder onto the floor, activating it. The device hummed, and the unmistakable sound of a broadcast filled the room. For a brief moment, the armed men stood frozen, caught off guard by the sudden surge of noise. In that moment of confusion, Holmes and Watson moved swiftly, their training and instinct kicking in. Holmes disarmed the nearest man with a quick, decisive motion, while Watson followed suit, incapacitating another. It didn't take long before the entire room descended into chaos, but Holmes remained calm, methodical. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, just as he had predicted. The men who had once been in control of the room were now in disarray, their plans unraveling. As the last of the armed men was subdued, Holmes turned to the man who had been leading the consortium's operations. "It's over," he said, his voice low and final. The man, his eyes wide with panic, tried to move toward the door, but Holmes blocked his path. "You can run, but the world knows now. The web you've spun is unraveling, piece by piece. There's nowhere left to hide." The man's face twisted in anger, but Holmes stood firm. "You can fight or you can face the truth. Your choice." With a defeated sigh, the man slumped to his knees. The weight of the situation had broken him. The truth, everything he had fought to protect, to hide, was now out in the open. He had no recourse. It was over. Holmes and Watson stood over him, watching as the man's world crumbled. The final blow had been struck, but there was no satisfaction in it. This wasn't about victory. It was about the truth and the toll it had taken on those who had been caught in its path. With a final glance at the defeated man, Holmes turned to Watson. "It's done. The consortium will fall. The truth has been exposed." Watson nodded, his eyes still sharp with the remnants of adrenaline. "And the world will be different because of it." They left the room without another word, knowing the battle was over. The sun was setting as they walked out into the streets of New York, the city now pulsing with a different energy. It was as if the air itself had shifted. The storm had passed and the world was beginning to breathe again. Holmes's gaze drifted upward, his mind already turning toward the next case. There would always be more mysteries to solve, more puzzles to piece together. But for now he could rest easy, knowing that for once the truth had won.